You're listening in on an animated discussion about Harley Quinn on DC Universe with three experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
I'm Sara Century, media critic and writer.
And I'm Avishai Weinberger, screenwriter and filmmaker.
And today we'll be covering the first 3 episodes of Harley Quinn. Okay, listeners, I have a little bit of housekeeping for you just to let you know. This is a big experiment. We just finished, like all of us in the world, just finished the first season of Harley Quinn on DC Universe. And I've been toying with doing a podcast about it the entire run because I was so blown away by it. And I had decided to just put that idea on the shelf until they announced the second season dropping very early in April. And I was like, okay, I'm going to ask 2 people to help me with this show. And if they both say yes, then we're doing it. And they both said yes. And so we're doing it. But that means we're going to be a little on hiatus with the new Batman Adventures and Superman the Animated Series while we do 4 episodes of the podcast covering the entire first season of Harley. So that's enough of that housekeeping. Let me introduce my guests. First, someone you may be aware of if you are listening to my Superhero University podcast. She has joined me on there to unpack the mysteries of Carol Danvers, Sara Century. Sara, welcome to an animated discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to talk about Harley Quinn.
You've been talking about Harley Quinn, like in the world a lot, I think, because of this show. I've seen several articles that you have penned or co-penned of late. Were you a big fan of Harley Quinn before the show, or have you been kind of plus minus on her? Where are you at with Harley?
Well, I think I was introduced to her in the same way a lot of people are, where I saw her obviously on Batman the Animated Series. And I don't know, she to me wasn't that compelling of a character to begin with because
Sure.
I don't like her dynamic with the Joker, obviously. But she gets really interesting very quickly. She becomes friends with Poison Ivy, and I was always a huge fan of Poison Ivy. So, yeah, she kind of got more interesting for me pretty quickly, and then I've been reading her comics, ever since.
Yeah. I know you a little, like we're not BFF, but we've worked together a little bit. I know you a little. And the fact that you've always been a fan of Ivy comes as 0% shock. That makes so much sense.
Oh, yeah. She's just the obvious one.
Just very low key, also very annoyed,
Little annoyed. Yeah. And also just passionately believes in the causes that she is involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we'll talk about it, takes some issue with the way that those are portrayed outside, in the media narrative or whatever. In this show, she also has a problem with that. That's very good.
Yes.
And joining us here today is also Avishai Weinberger. Avishai, welcome to an animated discussion.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation, and I apologize in advance to all the listeners for my snuffly nose.
Happens to the best of us. It's fine. We're going to record these so quickly that they may never know another you, as far as this show. But that's okay, because you're going to bring that heat. And so, with that in mind, tell me, what was your experience with Harley Quinn before this show? Because if I know this, you're not like the biggest comic book guy. Is that right?
Well, I'm somewhat of a comic book guy. I grew up reading comics,
Yeah.
And I still read comics. I haven't really been keeping up so much with the big two. So I haven't been really subscribing to Marvel and DC, and so whenever I jump into something, I'm always slightly confused as to the state of the universe, multiverse, whatever reboot we're currently on. But I always knew about Harley Quinn. She was always in the zeitgeist when I first jumped in, when I first started reading. But it took me a while to really understand who she was. I always knew what she was. She was the Joker's girlfriend and a sidekick, essentially, kind of his Robin. But then the more I looked into it, and when I saw, I think was the episode called Mad Love, the origin of
That's
Harley Quinn?
the comic.
That's the comic. Okay.
Yeah, by Paul Dini.
Yes, that's right. There's an episode based on that comic book also that gets toned down just a little bit from the comic. It's not her first appearance, but it's probably her most famous appearance on BTAS, I think.
Right. That was what I was familiar with. I was familiar with the animated version. And it struck me as really fascinating that she was his psychiatrist and that she is in this prolonged, manipulative, abusive relationship that she's in denial about, which I think is an intensely relatable thing for a lot of people. And it was fascinating to see this show really dive into what that looks like. So I was interested in that. And then the more I saw of her in media, the more I saw the story kind of pivot towards what does she look like outside of that relationship. And that was really interesting because she was no longer defined by what function she served in the Batman story. She was no longer an accessory of Joker. She is suddenly this character with this trauma in her background who is redefining herself and is also just really fun at the same time. And that got my attention. So when I saw the ads for this show and that it would be following this incarnation of her, I was really interested.
I think that for me, I mean, I have also kind of always been aware of Harley Quinn since the minute she existed. One thing I've talked about on this very podcast before, when we were talking about Batman the Animated Series, is that I am at any moment about to crumble to dust, which means that I was running home after school to watch BTAS. And so like I was kind of there when Harley was introduced to the world. And I love these characters that get introduced outside of the comic books medium and then get absorbed like back into the source material. And I mean, Jimmy Olsen is one of those, and he's one of my like top 10 favorite characters in superhero comics ever.
I didn't know he originated out of the comic.
Yeah, he was originally introduced in the radio show.
Oh.
Yeah. Along with Kryptonite, which is just a little trivia, not really a character, but it entertains me to know that it took a radio show to figure out Kryptonite. But Renee Montoya is another one from BTAS who really made the move into the comics and just, made a huge splash there. But I think Harley is maybe, I mean, outside of Jimmy Olsen, Harley's probably the next like best example of that. And I only give the edge to Jimmy because the guy's been around for, 70 years and had a few hundred issues of his own comic to fall back on, But when I saw the trailer for this particular show, this incarnation of Harley, I was really expecting it to kind of be hot garbage. Like I could tell from the trailer that they were going to do some of the breakup stuff. But I mean, I think Sarah can absolutely sympathize with this. We cannot broadly trust DC in any of its incarnations to do right by Harley.
Yeah, or I mean, women at all.
No, I'm being specific, but you're not wrong.
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Like
I wish
the
I
wider
was.
problem. I know. I agree, and I think that's a wider, I guess, almost genre problem or culture problem.
Sometimes,
or business
but
problem.
DC is a whole thing.
Hard. Yeah. It's the whole, that's right. DC's the whole package of problems with female characters.
And they have so many opportunities to not be.
Yes, it's true. DC's never met an opportunity to do right by a female character that it didn't squander, I think.
But Harley's up there.
Here we are, though. This show, I think, really does it. So part of my skepticism with the trailer was that I just don't entirely trust DC with Harley. I hadn't seen the Birds of Prey movie yet, so I hadn't seen that they were kind of doing this even on the big screen. Not this exactly, but similar, And the humor in the trailer, they went... Now, I think the show is hilarious, so I want to say that right up front. I think the show is hilarious, but the humor that they focused on in the trailer was a lot of the kind of what I would call cartoons for adults humor, and if you can hear the quotation marks around adults, like cartoons for adults who have a very firm idea of what adults should be like that they developed when they were in 8th grade. That's kind of where I thought it was going to be. And there is some of that slapstick stuff, but really this show just got very, very smart, very, very quick, I think, in addition to, hilarious blood spurts and broken limbs and stuff like that. So what about you guys? Did you guys have any sort of preconceived expectations for the show before you watched the first episode?
I had a preconceived notion. When I first saw that trailer, I had two very concurrent thoughts. One was, this looks pretty fun. Like the humor was landing with me, and I liked the style of it. And the other was, I don't really have any interest in watching this. It looked like something that was intended for hardcore fans, or people who were very on board for, DC's getting its own streaming service, and I wasn't really in that group. And the more I saw ads for it as it was playing, and the funnier I saw those ads, the more I'm like, okay, there might actually be something here. But I agree with what you're saying about the for adults, quote unquote, because there's this feeling I think a lot of people have that if you make something sweary and gory and throw in sex and whatnot, that makes it adult. And if anything, I feel a lot of the times it really comes across as juvenile because it doesn't actually dive into the complexity and nuance of those things. It's just, look, we're doing it because we can.
Yeah.
But what struck me as adult about the show was how it, that's all surface, but it actually does have something to say beneath it, and is willing to explore those things in depth instead of just paying lip service to a degree. And that's what impressed me about it once I started. But when I just saw the ads, I thought, well, this looks kind of fun. Maybe I'll check it out eventually.
But you watched the first one and were sunk, not unlike myself.
Yeah, I think the first episode, just as a pilot structurally, is kind of perfect. It sets up the world that we're in. It sets up the characters, what they want, what the engine of the show is going to be going forward, and it pulls its theme from character arc, which I think a lot of shows and movies kind of tiptoe around. I really enjoyed the Birds of Prey movie. I do have some thoughts about its use of theme from sort of an external standpoint instead of from character. And this show is all about a character with a flaw and a goal, trying to overcome that flaw and trying to overcome that conflict. And exactly by the end of the first episode who we're going to be following, what they're going to be doing, why we're invested, and so on. So just as from that standpoint alone, I think it's really successful, and I had to just keep watching.
I can agree with the strength of the pilot, especially. I am so tired in the year of our Lord 2020 hearing that pilots get to be junk because they have to set everything up. And I'm like, that's not how this has to be. You're choosing to let it be that. And then here we have this Harley Quinn cartoon that's sweary and gory.
Pilots have this weird kind of burden on them because on one hand, they're the document that sells the show, essentially, like that and the Bible.
Yes.
But they're also the one episode where the writers have the least control because they're the ones that the studio is going to have thoughts about and the most notes about and is going to be deciding what they want to show an audience. And then once that's successful and takes off and they have a writer's room and the show gets picked up and gains steam, the more control the writers are going to have over the shape of the show. So sometimes you see a crummy pilot and you kind of get the sense that this wasn't the version they wanted to write, but it is the version that will allow them to write what they will want to write.
Right.
And then every so often you get a pilot that just feels like maybe 1/3 of an act one of a longer story that they just feel they can write the first 60 pages of and then say, and that's episode 1, where it's just sort of an unfinished feature script that's really long. And you can kind of tell that that's not really a story in itself. And the energy that the show will have or won't have from that. So it was exciting to see an episode that was A, short, and B, pretty self-contained.
That's a big selling point for me, especially when they were releasing this kind of week to week, that I need each one of these to be a satisfying chunk of story, but also leave me wanting more. And they literally did that every week for 13 straight weeks. So now, I know, Sara, off mic, you were talking a little bit how you have a strange relationship with this show because you were being asked to write Harley things before the show was even out. So you have more general Harley thoughts, but weren't necessarily plus or minus on this show. You were just doing the work and coming to the show later.
Oh, no, I was minus it. I was extremely minus it because the first I heard of it, they were referring to Harley and Ivy as BFFs. And I think that requires a lot of erasure of what has been their relationship over the last couple decades. So I was already not having it 100% before I ever looked at the show. And people were like, hey, it's really good. You should listen. You should watch it. You'll enjoy it. You'll hate all the things that we know you're going to hate, but it's actually good. And I was like, yeah, that happens sometimes. So I watched the pilot, and it is a really flawless pilot. Also, it's a love story between Ivy and Harley, like 1,000%.
It absolutely is.
Ivy is so there for her in ways that I mean, I have really close friendships with a lot of people, but I just don't know. I don't know that many friends who would go to those links, I guess, those specific links, because it becomes very romantic across the episode, I think. So, and so that saved it a little bit. I'm also really tired of just watching Harley break up with the Joker again and again. I understand that there's part of that story that just needs to be repeatedly told, but at the same time, I just have been reading the comics for a really long time, so I'm kind of tired of it. But I mean, that's part of her story, and it's honestly one of the most important parts of her story, because that is how she goes out, does her own thing. So every single Harley story starts with that in a lot of ways, but I just didn't want to watch it again, I guess. And once I actually saw the show, I was like, I like it. I mean, I have my issues, but I like it.
The fact that it's so good, but that there are also some things worth unpacking and interrogating, is part of the reason, since after 2 or 3 episodes of the actual show, I was like, I probably need to do a podcast about this. Because it is pretty great. It's pretty enjoyable, but it's not untouchable. Like, there are some choices they make, and some of them are with Harley and Ivy, and I really want to talk to you about them. Even in terms of these first 3 episodes, but also the run as a whole. But I want to have a superhero nerd moment with you, where do you feel like the reason we have to keep retelling that story, I'm going to tip my hand with my own personal theory, and you can just tell me if you think it's bunk, that we have to keep retelling the Harley breaks up with Joker story because it just doesn't stick, like continuity is accreted. It's not really, handed down on high. We all have stuff collectively and individually that we ignore from our favorite characters' stories. And I just feel like the Harley breaks up with Joker story never quite stuck in a big enough way that they could keep on going with it.
But that's why people like Harley. I mean, people like Harley and Joker as a couple when they like Joker, but those aren't the people who are going out and supporting Harley individual things. So I think that the difference between any kind of superhero origin story like Batman, he has something really terrible done to him. In some ways, this relationship is something that is terrible that is done to Harley, but at the same time, it's what a lot of people in abusive relationships go through. So, we look at statistics of women going back to the person who abuses them and things like that, and how complicated that is. And I think that with Harley, a lot of times we have the opportunity to look deeper into that, and it fails or succeeds sometimes, right? It's not the way it works always. You can't expect a comic to be reality 100%, but there's times where people do say, oh, well, she'll just go back to him. She'll just go back to him. That is something that people who are abused hear all of the time. And it sucks. Like, the idea of turning that narrative around, I think, is something that is really great about Harley. And so the way that we look at that, I think, always has to be, well, women do go back to their abusers because we have a much more complicated world. Like, there's housing issues. There's the way that people treat Harley whenever she leaves. People have no faith in her whatsoever. So, I mean, to me, that's a much deeper story in a lot of ways, and it can't always be compacted into a superhero narrative, but sometimes it can be. But yeah, I guess that would be my thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think some of the catching on that I meant was like kind of in the wider culture, like Harley's in the wider culture, but mostly as Joker's girlfriend.
Right.
And now we're having to do the work, like we collectively, but mostly the creators, right, are having to do the work of having her in the culture as no longer Joker's girlfriend, but I don't want that to be forever. Can we just get to the place where she's just Harley, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, that's what a lot of fans want to see, because, as I say, people who have been into Harley for a long time and actually, you know, keeping up on the books and things like that. Like, I read all of the Connor Palmiotti books, and I think that those are really good because they show that's where she defines herself. So whenever I watch something where she hasn't defined herself, to me, sometimes that does feel like stepping backwards. But that is always the beginning of a good Harley story, is that Harley went through some bad stuff and then she comes out on the other side. And then this is where we're at and this is where we go, right? So, I mean, they're going to have to keep telling the story. You can't really avoid it, you know? But at the same time, I have emotions. You know, I can understand why things happen the way that they do, but I also have feelings and don't always want to watch somebody, you know, hung up on their abusive ex. Sometimes I need to take some space for myself. So that was kind of my response, I guess, to like just kind of rehashing the story. In the movie, they don't really, though. They just kind of, it's over at the beginning of the movie, right? So, and I've had people criticize that because they felt like there was a gap, right? And, you know, that's part of the empowerment of this story, is that she does actively go through these steps to get away from this guy.
One of my core ideas, I have like a few core ideas for superhero stories that I'm realizing may also be correct for villains who are, it's still a superhero story, right? Even if there's only one kind of in the background. And one is that they should battle internal conflicts externalized, right? Like, it's got to be turned into a problem you can punch, or the whole thing falls apart. Like the whole house of cards just goes to pieces. And I really like that they've done that with Harley's relationship to the Joker, you know, in the length of this series. They did that, you know, so that even within this 13 episodes, she makes some steps forward, takes 2 steps back, you know, but we still see the overall momentum of the thing.
It's an arc, right?
Yeah, it's an arc, and it makes it a little more realistic is maybe not the right word, but like it does speak to the experience of women in abusive relationships, while also hitting one of my other big superhero ideas, which is they should be aspirational, you know, and taking a villain and putting her in a place where we can be where she can be aspirational for us or for women who are in these relationships. Great. You guys are doing great.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me because you have the movie, the Harley Quinn movie, where it explores what does an independent Harley look like without making it about the Joker. He never shows up in the film. She's broken up with him in the first 10 minutes, and it really stops being about him. And it follows her trying to learn how to be a better person, how to work well with others, and all that stuff. Where they're, you know, the show. It's what interests me is how it, like you say, it externalizes that inner conflict of how do you leave once you've left, which is something I don't see very much of. She's left him at the beginning of the show, but she hasn't really left him because he has so much real estate in her mind. He has, she has so much real estate in his mind, and it's about how do you let go of that once you've already left that manipulative relationship. And in the second episode, it struck me that she's trying to prove herself as an independent supervillain who can hold her own with the Legion of Doom. And towards the end of the episode, which has largely not included the Joker, he's there as pressure on her. But towards the end, after, you know, kind of jumping ahead plot-wise, everybody's held guns at her. Joshua's held a gun at her. The Joker showed...
Not me.
Not you.
Just in case you haven't seen the episode, there is a character...
named Joshua, and also this Joshua. They both held guns at her. The Joker then shows up kind of randomly and looks at her face and says, "You will never be anybody without me. You're a nobody," as a kind of just to remind us that he's the face of that feeling for her.
Yes, yeah.
Which is interesting because it gives him a very specific function. He serves her character and not the other way around.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at each individual episode, but I wanted to, and we've kind of, in this conversation, tipped our hands a little bit. But let's start with Sara. Sara, if you tell me a little bit, what would you consider the themes, right, of these first 3 episodes.
Right. So the first one is about breaking up, not necessarily in an easy way, I guess. It takes a lot for Harley to see how terrible this person is. And actually the thing that makes her understand it is the fact that Joker has a bigger crush on Batman than on her. And then the second one is kind of just, the repercussions of that and her kind of jumping around and trying to get her own stuff. Like, I'm so cool with it. I'm so cool with being broken up with. And then, which is true to life. We've all been there. And then the third one is basically just her trying to get her crew, because that is always the next thing that Harley does in every single Harley story.
It's true. I like that last bit because I'm a big fan of, for a long time, of heist movies. And so getting the crew together is a huge part of a heist, let alone one that you're, the crew you're going to work with over and over. So I do like that it does feel like it's, the first one's not so much about, or even these first 3 are maybe not so much about a breakup as they are about like the present progressive. I am breaking up with him.
Because the healthiness
it's a process
of her decisions are always based around her surrounding herself with a network, and that allows her kind of, because whenever people talk about her and the Joker, they're like, she was really needy and things like that, which are all, those are all gross things to say, really, kind of, but that's how she's portrayed, right? And then this, what is actually true is that she has a need for partnership, and Joker can't possibly fulfill that need, and therefore she finds a group of people where her affections can be spread out and not so centered. And so you can have a group around you. These people will help you. It's just, to me, it's her going from unhealthy fixation to teamwork and community building, which is, the happiest story you could have.
Boy, that's a really excellent point, that her need for a crew is not so much a need for validation or like external support as much as she's a person who wants to have like a reciprocated partnership. And
a lot of us do. And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And she definitely did not get that opportunity in the relationship with the Joker. So
no.
Avishai, would you say those themes, as Sara presents them, pretty on point? Do you have some fine tuning there or other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Sara. I have some additional thoughts because what really struck me about her gathering her crew together is, as much as it is about she needs those people around her, she's also doing that because she wants to prove to the world, and the world as represented by Joker, that she can rank up there with him. Mm-hmm. And it's this weird back and forth. Not weird. It's this interesting back and forth where she almost needs permission to be validated. Like, she needs, like, it's not enough to be broken up with him. She needs him to admit that she's doing well on her own and can rank up there with him, because she's, she gets that crew together because he shows her up with his crew. And so it's, and it's something that comes to a head later in the series, but she's almost using these relationships that she's building as a tool to get back at him, which is an unhealthy thing that she has to overcome. Right.
Yeah. That's, once again, I think is something that is pretty true to life. Yeah. I've definitely tried. I don't want to incriminate myself, but I've definitely tried to impress people after bad breakups. Not even necessarily because you want to get back with them, but you just want to have that sense of closure. And then, of course, what we all always have to realize is that having closure is a myth, and you will never have it, and you can't prove yourself to somebody who just doesn't care,
Right, and that's what she has to learn over the course of the show. Right. She doesn't need his validation or anybody's validation but her own. It's just that deep down she really feels like she does, because she's been in such a manipulative relationship with somebody who has made her feel worthless if he doesn't tell her otherwise. So she's kind of internalized that, and it's really interesting to see that play out even after she's technically free of him.
Right, and something that's always so interesting of her dynamic, I think, because I feel like a lot of times people sort of dismiss her work as a psychiatrist, but I think that one of the most important things about their relationship is that no matter how smart, talented, beautiful, whatever, you can still be in an abusive relationship, and it doesn't make you a lesser person. So I always think about that, because I think that that's actually one of the healthiest things about the way that their relationship is portrayed is that they don't make her seem like she was weak for making that mistake. It's validation that we all crave. It's things that we all do, in much smaller ways for the most part. But I just think that that's kind of one of the best things about it, is it's kind of showing you that you can validate yourself, Yeah,
absolutely. It's so human. And by the way, sidebar, I love what they're doing with her as a psychiatrist through this show, how they never let us forget it.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, Ivy has a framed photograph of Harley psychoanalyzing her in her apartment.
Yeah, that is real gay. I was like, wow, you guys, I never saw that in the comic really of, Harley treated her early on. And then I was like, oh my God, this is such a Dear Penthouse Forum kind of situation. Like my psychiatrist,
Dear Penthouse, I never thought it would happen to me, but here I am psychoanalyzing a plant woman that I kind of have the hots for.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
It's kind of beautiful.
I love that they have that pre-existing relationship.
Yes, I'm glad that, I don't know, I was thinking about them having a good pre-existing relationship and then just being like, it's so interesting that Harley doesn't know the effect that she had on Ivy, and then Ivy has to sit her down and be like, hey, you did things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sara, I was wondering if you read the showrunner Justin Halpern's comments about whether or not they're going to pursue a relationship between them next season.
I have tried kind of to stay away from it because my emotions, again, have gotten in the way of it.
There's only one answer that's going to make me happy.
Right.
So I'm afraid to know what his answer is.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I do think he gives a very interesting, he makes an interesting point about it. And if it's okay to talk about it, I'd like to ask about it.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So
I'm my teeth are gritted. I'm ready for the bad news.
So it's not bad news that he says that they want to pursue that down the line. He felt that these characters are in the moment dealing with problems that if they got together, people might dismiss it as rebounding or as impulsive.
Sure.
And that their plan is to have them address these things and then get together.
Yeah, I think that is a reasonable thing to say. And I also think that it's true. That's not how it happened in the comics. They didn't automatically go to them being in a long-term relationship with each other. But there was always, kind of like in this cartoon, a lot of hints to the fact that maybe that was happening the whole time, but in a subtle, not in your face kind of way, I guess. I think that makes sense. And obviously you want to be really careful around these characters because as Harley is coming from an abusive relationship, you never want to make it seem like she's just going into another one with the next powerful person that she is around. Yes. But we also have had this go on already, it's already been 20 years of this for me. So whenever you see that, and then it coincides also with the fact that they in the comics just broke them up, then, and also referring to them as BFFs and things like that, those are all bad, and that is not good. It is definitely the way that we see this play out a lot of times, where you just see people give you kind of these small amounts of recognition and then they pull it off of the table. And I think that obviously you don't want to have them immediately hook up because that's not realistic. You wouldn't immediately get over the person from before, and you wouldn't immediately see how wonderful Ivy is. But at the same time, it's a very complicated situation for people, I think, who have just been in it for a long time, because we've seen a lot of erasure on this relationship specifically a lot. And so it kind of just has been dragging out long enough, but I can see their perspective on it.
I have his quote where he says, when you are emotionally hurt and haven't dealt with your issues, you don't always pick the best partner for you. In fact, most of the time you pick the wrong one. So we felt like both of these characters needed to go through some things emotionally and grow as people before they would be in a place where they could really and truly experience a loving relationship and make it work. We're not trying to bait anyone or tease anyone. We pay off things in season 2 in a satisfying way.
This is all true. I just also think that the way that this has played out before and in the comic, we've already seen a lot of it. So, yeah, I don't know. If you're looking at the show in its own individual bubble, all of that really makes sense. And I think in some ways we have to do that because I think a lot of people who are watching this show don't necessarily read the comics maybe, or they do. I don't know. I don't want to really make aspirations, but I would say that they have done that already. And so it kind of just gets exhausting. And of course, you know, you have a lot of Ivy fans or like people who ship the two of them. We've already seen them be in a relationship, and now we watch like the movie where there's no Ivy, and then we see the cartoon where it's like, oh, they're just buddies, and you know, like it just kind of has a lot of language around it that I think makes people really bristle, and I think for really good reasons.
Gotcha. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is a difficult space. I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years with the MCU, if nothing else, right? Like, it's a difficult space in a way to know all the ways that this story could have gone already, you know? And in a lot of ways, I'm excited. I'm waiting to see how things get adapted. But when it comes to sort of specific character beats, and Harley and Ivy is a fantastic example of this, it's like, I want you to get to the damn point already, you know? At the same time, this series is really diving into her relationship with Joker and leaving that and getting healthier about that. And so that's why I was quietly prepared to like, okay, we'll wait and see what happens in season 2. I'm not going to get too excited.
But I could totally see, like, we don't know that they will do it because so often we've been let down. That sounds to me very valid.
Also just being, hey, they're roommates, you know? I mean, that was what the PR around it was. So that sucks. I don't really know what else to say about it. I think, honestly, though, you were talking about how this show delves into her relationship with the Joker. It super delves into her relationship with Ivy. Like, there's the focus. Nobody's watching this to watch, like, Kite Man or whatever. We're watching this because we want to see Ivy interacting with Harley, and Ivy is honestly one of the best parts of the show. So I can't be mad because I've seen so many bad adaptations of Ivy over the years and so much bad writing around that character that seeing her written well, I have to be very impressed. There's nothing else I can do. It's really good. And I think that everybody on this team does a great job by being, you know, I mean, that first episode, she really goes to bat for Harley in a way that I would have difficulty not reading as being subtextual, because also she's telling her that she loves her and things, which you do say to your friends, but I don't know. I just feel like there's always that element in the comics where Ivy is kind of there for Harley in ways, and then at a certain point Harley goes, wait a minute, this is more than friendship. I have friends, they don't do any of this stuff for me. And so I get them having that as an arc, right? I think that all of that makes perfect sense.
Right. Ivy has this line in episode 3 where she says, I love you, don't make a thing of it. I had that in my notes, so I wanted to say it. But I was speaking with another screenwriter, a mentor from a while back, who had this interesting point to make about TV shows in general, which is the strength of a TV show lives or dies on the main character relationship. And that can't just be, you know, protagonist, antagonist. It has to be, who does the protagonist, if there is just one, who do they love? Who are they with? Not necessarily romantically, but also romantically. All of these, I guess for lack of a better word, pairings, characters who work well together, who have chemistry together. When that dissolves, the show is usually in trouble.
Right.
And that's why we watch week after week, because the plot will always evolve. There will always be a different story every week. The status quo will change, but we need those relationships. That's what these shows are about. So here it really is Harley and Ivy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that in some ways that takes on different proportion for a lot of queer viewers, because there's just less of it, right? And the amount of representation that we get is so recent. And so we haven't had enough good interactions between queer characters, I think, for us to fully let it settle, you know? So a lot of things that are featuring queer characters really live and die on, you know, giving us what we want immediately, essentially, because we have a hard, you know, you never know when your queer character is, you know, as in the comics, is just going to be kind of straight washed, or you never know when your queer character is just going to be pulled out of the show entirely, killed off, you know, or villainized to an extreme degree, like Poison Ivy often is, even though Harley is equally as homicidal as her, at least. So, and has less of a direction, you know, like Ivy is very directed towards eco, you know, people call her an eco-terrorist, right? That's one of the jokes of the show. And she's like, I just don't want to kill plants. Like, what? So, yeah, I don't know. I think that this show obviously is under a ton of pressure. It's under pressure for things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the show, you know? Like, there's comics where this is happening, and Harley and Ivy are getting written out, and they're being referred to as besties. They say goodbye to each other forever in a recent comic, and Ivy just kisses her on the forehead, and everybody's like, wait, what?
They did that?
They sure did. And so that's happening at the same time, right? And we can't dismiss it, I guess, is kind of my response to everything. Is I really admire this show for doing all of the things that they do. I think that they're absolutely going through all of the steps that you would go through to do a good Harley Quinn TV series. I also, as a queer viewer, am just like, I don't want to keep watching subtext. I'm just kind of over it.
Right. And there's always that sort of Damocles that they're going to just not do it, or they're going to make it impossible for them to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we have kind of accidentally or incidentally covered most of episode 1, right? In this, because that's where it lays out the track, right? What are we going to do? This is what we're doing. We're breaking up with Joker, and we are in the process. Little does she know, she thinks it's one moment, but it's going to be a big process. And the reason I started to realize as we were all talking that I feel like we were covering episode 1 is that one of my favorite lines from episode 1 is Ivy going, I must really like you, because I spent my entire Saturday setting up something this stupid. and I was like, that is real friendship. I love it, you know?
and she's trying to get her to notice her. It's so gay.
Oh, it is. Oh my gosh. Do you know what? Okay. I'm going to tell you. Sarah's Twitter introduced me to the entire concept of the disaster gay. Oh. And I was like, okay, I don't want to definitively say this, but I really feel like Ivy's kind of treading into disaster gay territory on this show, and I like it.
Oh yeah, she's disaster bisexual, but she is definitely over that. Because you see her just going after this person who is completely hung up on somebody else, you know, and yeah, I mean, I would definitely be lying if I said I hadn't been there before. So she is certainly in disaster bisexual territory.
But to kind of wrap up, is there anything, like I said, we've kind of mostly talked about episode 1, I think. So before we move to episode 2 and really drill down there, is there anything else we're missing that you guys really wanted to bring up from the first episode? I could mention some character choices that are either hilarious and I love them, or hilarious and I'm scared of them, you know, like the Jim Gordon. This version of Jim Gordon is very funny, but also I'm sort of like my longtime Batman nerd is a little uncomfortable, you know, with this take on Gordon. But it's funny and I like it, and it works for this show very well, I think.
The great Chris Maloney.
He's just there to be the overworked cop, right? I mean,
right, yeah.
They kind of threw a lot of Gordon's characterization out the window for sure. So if Gordon was my favorite character, I would be like, nope.
He's going through a rough patch.
He's totally going through a rough patch. He's all 5 o'clock shadow and hunched over and drinking coffee at midnight.
And
I spackled over some Gordon problems by suggesting that we could rely on Harley as an unreliable narrator.
Oh yeah.
You know, but honestly, by the end of the first season, that is not the case. It's definitely this is who Gordon is in this.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
I mean, it's interesting to see how they go, dive into Gordon as the show goes, and how he just, he has no affection for him anywhere, and he just desperately wants a friend, and he wants Batman to be his friend, and he'll call Batman with the light just so that they can hang out. Like it's really fun. It's a version of him I haven't seen, especially since on this show, all of the superheroes are so straight-laced and stern and stoic in contrast to everybody else. It's fun to have somebody on the superhero team who's just completely falling apart around the edges in the most embarrassing way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll say, I agree with you. There's so much self-seriousness in the superheroes, and that we'll get to it when the actual episode comes. But that's one reason I really appreciate their approach to Superman on this show, because he is not self-serious. And why would he be? Nothing can hurt me. I can do whatever I want.
Oh, I have strong feelings about this.
Yeah, we'll get to it. That's great. Put a pin in it. All the thoughts. I also feel like I would be remiss personally if I didn't bring up the fact that I think Frank is the sensational character find of 2019 and a national treasure.
He's pretty funny.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that.
Okay, so moving into episode 2, we've talked a little bit about
Can I raise something for a second, by the way?
Oh, yeah, please.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just realized I didn't know where else to bring it up. We've been talking about the Joker as a functioning, as serving Harley's character functionally. I'm really interested in the way they portray him, because there are so many ways they could portray the Joker and the way he has been portrayed. And I've always had this deep-seated belief that he's an inherently pathetic character.
Yes.
Because, we've seen, especially recently this past year, we've seen the super serious, I've been wronged and I represent society kind of Joker. We've seen the criminal mastermind Joker. But if you think about him, he's just really desperate for validation, right? I mean, nobody wakes up one morning and just is a clown. He has to put on that persona. He has to create these acts of terror just for the validation. The screams are laughs to him, and if that ever stopped, he would be really bummed out. If Batman ever stopped giving him attention, he would be really bummed out, and he would sort of cease to be potent. And I love that on this show, he is so deeply invested in what other people think about him.
Yes. Yeah, I really like that approach. I mean, the Joker is very cool a lot of times, right? Like, he's got a good look and the outfit and the plans and all that stuff. And I think that this is a problem with really good villains, is that people who want to look at them as the protagonist, and I mean, DC Comics has done this themselves more than once, made the Joker the protagonist of his story. But there still needs to be this sort of core something broken or missing that moves them from criminal to supervillain. Like, we can look and go, on the surface that's cool, but recognizing that there's stuff under the surface that is not cool is really powerful and really important. And I don't think it happens to Joker often enough, because DC likes their checks. Yeah,
and he's so often kind of, it's almost like people worship him as a character. Like, he just is the apex of what a supervillain can be. But you pull all that aside, and he really is, I mean, he is a joke, just by definition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Harley is one of the characters that always pushes him into pure villainy for me, because he is totally incapable of loving anyone. And you see that whenever you see him with Harley. It has nothing to do with her that he's with her.
Right. He's a narcissist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I like that this show doesn't really put him on a pedestal. It's like she does, but the whole time the audience is reminded, oh yeah, he's garbage and is not worth anybody's attention. He's just grabbing it.
And it shows how threatened he is by women, too, which I think is very important if you're going to tell a story like this, is to show that the Joker is terrified of Harley because he dismisses her as a way to make himself more powerful. And whenever that stops working, then he has a crisis. And that is 100%. I mean, we've seen that happen in our day-to-day lives, I'm sure.
Let me, I'm going to jump ahead to episode 3 for just a second, because Sara, that observation I think is really important in this show in terms of comparing Joker and Dr. Psycho.
Yeah.
Because we see in his very introduction that Dr. Psycho is also a misogynistic, awful human being, right? Who is angry at women at least, but there's, you know, all the armchair psychoanalyzing I can do. There's a fear of being inadequate, you know, underneath that. And the longer the show went on, the more I watched how it dealt with these two very similar characters, Psycho and Joker, in the fact that they both clearly hate women, right? But one of them's part of the family, and the other one is very much not. But we never, I guess, ratify is the word we never ratify the behavior or the thought patterns of Dr. Psycho, you know? And in fact, we see him grow and change a little bit over the course of 13 episodes. He does not get over his big problem by any stretch, but we see some change that comes from being part of Harley's crew, and we're never going to see that with Joker, right? And anyway, I just found it really fascinating the more I watched that there's a lot of similarities in those two characters from that perspective, but that the show never says it's okay for Psycho to be that guy, you know, but it also doesn't vilify him in the same way that it does the Joker because he's in the family. Did you guys have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I was a little perplexed by the inclusion of Dr. Psycho, because even whenever he's on television and they're like, oh, he said the C word or whatever that whole joke is, yes, he's sitting right next to Giganta. And when Harley goes, oh, I'm going to build a crew with the people that nobody believes in, I'm just like, she's going to go get Giganta. And then she goes after the raving misogynist, which is baffling. I even checked the credits because I was like, was this written by a woman? Like, and it was. So I don't know, assumptions. They're bad. But I was baffled by it because this guy in the comics, he's awful in ways that they don't really touch on here. Because, I mean, in the comics, he attacks women in terrible ways. And so, it was just weird to see him here. And it was weird to see him have a redemption arc in a way, because it's not like really that, but it's definitely people. I mean, he learns to sympathize, right? As you were talking about, like, there's a little bit of an arc there. It's not, once again, they don't really sympathize with him like 100%, but there's a bit of an arc, and some sympathies are with him. And I thought that choice was kind of baffling just in and of itself. But there is a difference between Joker and Dr. Psycho in the series. In the comic, it's a lot harder to differentiate the two, but
that's true. Yeah.
Here I had to put my comic brain on hold, I guess, for this one to be like, all right, I guess Dr. Psycho's a thing now in this show. Because I never would have made that choice ever. That's one of those villains that you just never want to see again, kind of.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Both from a kind of he's super gross and I don't know that I want him in more stuff, and from a continuity distillation perspective. You know, it's like, right. Well, that's a choice you can make, and it works. I think it works beautifully, although your question about Giganta is very fair.
Yeah, what was that about? I was baffled. I couldn't put my head around it.
Yeah. That would have been, you know what? Almost any explanation I come up with here on the fly does not actually make it better. So you know what? We're not going to make assumptions, but we are going to wonder if maybe there was a better choice to be had in there.
Yeah. It makes sense almost from a structural standpoint, not necessarily from an in-world standpoint.
Right.
Because structurally, we understand he was a power player and she's desperate to have a team just to use as a tool to prove that she can, and to have somebody who is going to offer nonstop conflict that way. But within the context of the story, it would have been nice, if she at least reached out to Giganta.
Yeah, well, I'm so baffled. She was going through a terrible situation. And also just the implication of him mind controlling Giganta. So I was going to even say, in the show, he's not like, in the comic, he's straight up a rapist. So, I was like, but in the show, he's not. And then I was like, he is though, because
he probably is. Yeah.
It just literally started out with him being like, oh yeah, you mind controlled me into believing I was in love with you. And it's like, well, that certainly does not entail consent in any way.
Indeed.
So yeah, I don't know. It was confusing.
I have that in my notes also. Of it's such a bombshell line, and I missed it the first time I watched the show. And watching it again, I'm like, oh, she actually does say that. That's yeah, we're never going to unpack that. And it's said in such it's just sort of tossed out like that, so casually. You don't even see her face when she says it. You don't see her face when she says anything. But you go there. I think you have to go there. Like, what does that mean for him as a character going forward? And I don't think the show ever really comes back to that.
Also, why is it easier for Harley Quinn to immediately relate to him as opposed to talking to Giganta at all? Yeah, that was very, very strange. We have
an answer for that, Sarah, and it's, imprinting. Like the similarities with the Joker actually make going to Dr. Psycho easier for her in a way than maybe reaching out to Giganta, or at least that's a way to read it.
Well, I mean, I would think that they would have to, as you say, they'd have to unpack that if that was going to be the overall theme of that situation. But yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you just see little weird throwaway things in shows, and once you actually kind of examine it, it sort of makes your brain explode. And I feel like this was one of those.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes sense kind of within the context of the scene, at least, of she goes to a bar, asks who wants to be my henchman, and people are willing to jump into hell dimensions and die rather than go be on her team. People go to Kite Man before to her, and so she just sees this guy who she's seen on the news and is like, hey, do you want to be a disposable henchman for me? And he's like, I guess. Like, from her perspective, since she is just putting a team together in order to show up the Joker, because she hasn't overcome that yet, it's like it's almost like showing that she'll just go with literally anybody and that she doesn't really care who's on her team. Which I think is interesting, but then you really do have to unpack that.
Right, exactly, because showing a person be completely complicit in rape culture and then not following up on it in any way is definitely, as I say, it's a choice. And
it's a choice.
I don't think I'm going to make it to the end of my thoughts on it today, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, good news. He's around the whole rest of the season, so we'll have lots of opportunities to come back to.
You're right. That's
Dr.
great
Psycho
news.
problem.
The Dr. Psycho problem.
I hope that you heard the sarcasm in the great news. And yes, the Dr. Psycho problem. We may need an entire segment of these episodes going for that. So I kind of jumped episode 2, but we're talking about episode 3 a little bit. If you guys want to talk more about the rest of her crew, or at least the rest of the crew that we get in this episode.
I love Clayface.
Yeah.
I also love Clayface. And this is a take on Clayface I haven't really seen before. We've had ex-actors, but they generally stop being actors and just become villains who know how to act, Whereas this feels like an actor who went, well, I'm a big monster in Gotham, so I guess my only career option is stealing stuff,
But it's so smart, because he could become literally anybody. If you're going to make him a person who nobody else really wants on their team for obvious, like nobody else has chosen him to be their henchman. So what is his flaw? His flaw is that he just can't let a role be diminished. He needs to make it as big as possible. He needs everything to be Shakespeare, and I think that's such a brilliant way to play with his character, because it will never it will never not be his undoing.
Right, because his acting in the past was always considered to be kind of a vanity. Watching him have a genuine love for his craft is just, I'm a workaholic, so this is the stuff I really love to see. I'm just like, he loves his work. He loves his work so much. I loved that. And if you're around actors, I've worked in film a little bit, and so I've been able to be around actors, and it's always nice to see people have a sympathetic view of them, I guess, because they're so seldom portrayed as being complex individuals. It's almost always just this narcissist, like that kind of thing. So to me, it's a delightful character, and I like the way that he defies that stereotype, I guess.
And Alan Tudyk playing double duty as the Joker and Clayface.
I know.
So versatile.
What a great actor.
He's doing some fine work for DC Universe as a whole, because he is also Mr. Nobody on Doom Patrol, and kills all 3 of these, just nails them. So I did not quite expect to appreciate Clayface to the level that I do, but this is such a unique take on him, and he really does go so hard for every role. And his turn to Dr. Psycho and saying, she really does demand perfection, doesn't she? And I was like, that's it. He's going to just paint his life the way he needs to paint it to get to do his acting stuff. And it's great.
Yeah, I have such a soft spot in my heart for people who just love their job. So I loved watching it.
Also, I was very pleasantly surprised by the shout out to Oklahoma. I am an Oklahoma native. I do not live anywhere near Muskogee, but a mention of Muskogee, Oklahoma, I was like, whoa. Well, thank you, friends, for remembering we exist.
Yes, because it's exactly what an actor would come up with for their backstory for a character.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's the most stereotypically Oklahoma thing ever. It's very, I enjoyed that on an extra level there myself.
Yeah.
And who can forget, like, just play the mailman. Here's the mail, Dad. I don't know. It's just, he doesn't need to be, he doesn't want to do crimes for the crimes. He wants to do crimes for the opportunity to play people. And that's just so fun.
It's great. Yeah. Yeah. And it also explains why this version of Clayface is looking for a crew, because a lot of times he tends to be the lone wolf as far as supervillains go. He works alone or he is masterminding something. But this version of him, it really makes sense. He's like, I don't want to have to think about the whole crime. I just want to know my part and then play it to the hilt.
He's not chasing anything specific. He just wants to do this.
Yeah. So not part of the crew, but we also have a visit from Maxie Zeus in that episode.
Oh my God.
This is also, I feel like, a great take on Maxie Zeus, who has always been a guy who got so rich and full of himself that he decided he was a god, right? But is inherently pathetic in a way that's usually pretty obvious. So turning him into, one of these like very shady guru types, I thought was as masterful in its own way as the Clayface take. How did you guys feel about Maxie?
We have that in screenwriting. Those people, it's like, hi, I have never sold a script in my life, but for $1,000 I will give you notes on your script. It's
right.
It's and just the way that he hypes himself up, it's like Darkseid, Luthor, Maxie, like it's
like, no, Maxie, not on your best day.
And also continuing the trend of rapey villains.
That was the downside,
that's
but also
awkward.
It was. Yeah, good God. That whole scene, I was just like, ah! But also totally the comic character. That was maybe one of the most faithful adaptations.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
You look at him and you're like, yeah, I know that guy. We all know that guy.
We have all met that guy and we lament that day. Yeah.
None of us want to hang out with him. He's a great villain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think kind of last big appearance in that episode was the Queen of Fables.
Yes.
As the tax code. Well, I love her. What about you guys?
Yeah, I think that's her. Comic book people, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that is what happened to her in the comics, right? She does get trapped in the tax code.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, Sarah?
I don't know if it was specifically the tax code. I do remember her getting trapped in a book, though.
Yeah. There was some poetic justice going on there, but I appreciate it being the tax code because it's like, we can't put her where the stories are. She'll get more powerful. Put her in the place where all stories die, the tax code.
Yeah, but there's this line in there, a guy robs a bank, he's a criminal mastermind. A woman robs a bank, she's a crazy bleep. And using her to kind of exemplify that, like, I'm curious what you two think, especially you, Sarah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was very profound. It seemed like a very Wanda Sykes comment, too. So we have Wanda Sykes as the voice, right? It seemed like something I would see in one of her stand-up specials, which I enjoy. I thought that she was just a really good take on it because I have seen her in the comics, and I believe that that's 100% how they treat that villain. She's so interesting. How interesting, the Queen of Fables. Wow. Mind blown. That is such a good idea for a villain, and especially a villain, right? Like, that would be an interesting hero, much more interesting villain. So just the way that she has generally been dismissed in the comic and how little use we've gotten out of her, despite how interesting that concept is, I think speaks for itself. So this part was great because it was kind of one of those metatextual moments, right? Where oh, I'm outside of the story, commenting on the story, but I'm in the story.
Right. And who better than Queen of Fables? Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought it was great. You know, the fact of her being without a body is such a commentary on being robbed of your autonomy, you know. So all of it, to me, I think comes together really well. I don't know, because as I say, I've only watched up to episode 3 at present. I don't know if she comes back, but she was an incredibly interesting character to introduce here in the way that they did.
Oh, she comes back.
Great to hear, because that would be a huge bummer if they set her up this well and then just whoop, bye. And that's what they do in the comics. So
it's true. I think they learned their lesson. I don't actually have anything to add to that. That's I loved this whole commentary that happened, you know, both textually and metatextually, and with the casting and the choice of the tax code and all that stuff is so good. And that was the last thing I was going to say, Sarah, is that actually she's like Chekhov's villain. She crops up a few more times, you know, and we actually have several Chekhov's whatnots. Like, I don't want to go all the way back to episode 1, but, you know, Chekhov's highway, that's going to come up a few times.
She really wants a highway.
They do a great job of paying off a lot of these, you know, a lot of these promises.
I wonder when they wrote that in, if they knew where it was going and then went back and added it in, or if they wrote that line and then decided to pay it off.
As a writer, I am so desperate to know. You have no idea. I'm with you. All right, so jumping back in time, friends, we'll take a look at episode 2. I didn't mean to skip it, but that comparison between Joker and Psycho was, you know, right there. So let's go back one to Harley's first attempt to prove that she doesn't care what the Joker thinks when she obviously deeply cares. Episode 2, she visits Penguin's nephew's bar mitzvah accidentally. There's a lot of really good gags in this episode. I like the introduction of Kite Man, very important. You know, he's going to be around a lot more. But there's also a lot of stuff going on in this episode. How did you guys find it broadly?
So I have some thoughts on the Jewishness, and it's going to be a thing.
Okay. Sarah, are you prepared to like just step back, let the man go for a minute?
Oh yeah, of course, please.
Okay. So just in the interest of time, I'll be kind of quick about this, but I get the sense that there are Jewish writers in this room, and there are jokes over the course of the show that feel like jokes Jews tell each other, that we don't necessarily want to tell non-Jews because they are about Jewish stereotypes. So hearing jokes like that pop up on a show like this, which is, you know, it's a very mainstream comic book thing meant for a very mainstream, not necessarily Jewish specifically audience, like say Mrs. Maisel is for like a Jewish audience as well as everybody else. Sometimes those jokes feel a little yikesy, and they're less so in this episode, and more so kind of going forward. There are a few jokes that made me go, oh, I want that gone. You start to see it here because you know, when I first started watching this show, when I just saw the first episode, a friend of mine reached out to me and said, "Oh, have you heard that there's discussion going on about whether or not this show is anti-Semitic?" I'm like, "Oh, really? Huh? I wonder how they're gonna get there." And you start this show, and it's, you know, they've decided to make Penguin Jewish, and to make a whole episode revolving around a bar mitzvah. Now, this episode didn't bother me so much, partly because a lot of the jokes aren't really at the expense of Jews. They're kind of at the expense of bar mitzvah parties, which I feel like enough people have been to. And this was a very secular bar mitzvah party. This wasn't like a religious, like nobody's making fun of Joshua for being Jewish. They're making fun of him for being immature, right? They're making fun of him for not being a man yet, and it's like that's all fine. There's always been discussion about whether or not the Penguin is an anti-Semitic caricature. You know, it dates back at least to Tim Burton's Batman Returns. He is, you know, he's a hook-nosed, short, fat man who lusts after money and like loves herring. Like there's a question about whether or not that's a stereotype. So on one hand, I kind of appreciate that they just sort of went there and said, you know what, screw it, he's Jewish. And they make fun of that by the first time he shows up, he has a platter of shrimp, which is not kosher. Which, you know, a lot of Jews don't keep kosher, but I thought that was a pretty funny juxtaposition. But
yeah, totally.
He's also voiced by a non-Jewish actor doing a Jewish stereotype voice, which gives me pause.
Oh, snap.
And there's this one gag at the end of the episode that, in context, makes perfect sense. But as a Jew who's sort of waiting for a shoe to drop, kind of like Sara, you and the Ivy thing, to a much lesser degree for me, but I'm always kind of waiting for the joke to then turn on the Jews, and to end an episode with a very Jewish stereotype woman handing out money bags as party favors struck me as a little yikesy. And I get in context it's because it was supposed to be a bank heist themed bar mitzvah, but it rubbed me the wrong way just as an image, and I don't bear any ill will against anybody who wrote it, and I did think that the episode in general was very funny, and a lot of those jokes, completely didn't faze me. It just gave me pause, and there are jokes coming up that in later episodes that make me go, oh man, it's a shame I'm going to have to compartmentalize on this show. This is a show that I'm going to deeply enjoy and also deeply be uncomfortable about.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts.
So I thought something that's really interesting about that is essentially just the fact that Harley is Jewish and we don't hear any mention of it. And so the comparison, I think, because you go, oh, well, maybe they were just, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There's always a way to come back on it of be like, well, I'm sure they didn't mean it or something. But to me, it's the fact that the Jewish person that we do see is so strongly stereotyped in ways that, as you say, we've been commenting on this for like a little while, but there's no commentary around Harley's heritage, right?
Well, there will
as far as I know.
There will be.
It does come up in the show, and I do have thoughts about that when we get to it.
Okay. Yeah, I just remember watching this episode and thinking, why? Why isn't there any commentary? I was just curious why it seemed, she seemed to have no connection to it, I guess, in a way. And so that was sort of odd, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And kind of just vaguely jumping forward without getting too into it, her Jewishness does come up. And it was the first time that I learned that she was Jewish. It comes up in ways that I wasn't super uncomfortable about. My sister was. And when she explained why, I'm like, actually, yeah, I very much see that. I will say that I don't think the show is as responsible about Jewish jokes as I wish it was. There are some places where I feel like it unintentionally falls into pitfalls, and some places where I feel like it intentionally falls into pitfalls. And like I said, when we get to those moments, I'm going to ring a bit of a bell about them.
Yeah. Great. That's actually, I'll kind of pull back the curtain a little bit. That's kind of how I started speaking with Avishai originally, is that I was told he's a fan of the show, and I was looking for some insight here, because looking at this episode, I was like, okay, I also have pause about Penguin, and I can see the Moneybag party favors. But overall, the majority of it really felt, I want to say respectful, but maybe what I really mean is that, yeah, this could have been a party for any milestone. It didn't have to be a bar mitzvah. For any of the gags, so to speak, for it to work, it didn't have to be a bar mitzvah, but they made it one anyway, which feels like reasonable. Again, they make some missteps, but it feels like a good way to sort of normalize being Jewish in media, in a way that maybe it doesn't happen all the time.
I'm not against having an episode set at a bar mitzvah that makes bar mitzvah jokes. It depends on how it's done, because, for example, I was recently shown an episode of Frasier, a show I am mostly new to, but there's this one episode where the main character, Frasier, pretends to be Jewish because his new girlfriend is Jewish and he has to impress her parents. And it's playing on all sorts of stereotypes, but it feels loving. It feels like it wasn't attacking any of them. And in this episode, I generally didn't feel attacked by any of them. I'm like, okay, that's fine. It's really just the fact that it's the Penguin, and there's always going to be this unease about, if down the line I feel like it has been safe, I could probably look back at this more fondly. In the moment, I didn't really trust it, just because it is the Penguin. It's like he's Jewish because he has a big nose, I guess, and that's a little awkward. And I kind of wish that they reckoned with that a little bit more. And then down the line, some jokes are like, okay, this makes me less comfortable in retrospect with what they did because I don't think they were looking out for me.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really appreciate your insight there and you flagging those kinds of things as we go, because one thing that I've really appreciated as you and I have chatted about it in the lead up to the show is that you're like, no, largely the whole thing still works. And largely it feels... again, respectful is probably too strong a term, but that there are some places where you're like cringy and I don't appreciate it.
Largely, it doesn't feel malicious, and coming up there will be jokes that feel malicious.
That's what a ride that I have to hedge around too respectful, and actually what I mean is not malicious. And I think that probably tells the tale, in and of itself, that it's like what we're shooting for is not malicious.
Right. Who's the target of the joke,
Yeah.
Right. It's 2020, I just think sometimes we go, well, they weren't trying to, kick me in my feelings, but it's also just like, I mean, we kind of have to be a little bit more with our eye on that stuff these days because, and all days really, but these days I'd say pretty specifically there needs to be, just people need to be a little bit more responsible, I guess.
And it kind of brings up what you were saying before, Sarah, about the fear of they might not do the Iris Harley pairing justice because we've seen that so many times not done justice, and they haven't given a signal that, like a real signal that they will.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be in that position, right? That's something that I think a lot of audiences have to endure a lot with a lot of different medias, and I mean, it sucks. I don't know.
So it's sort of like, I talk to people who aren't Jewish about the show. None of this pings their radar, and rightly so. Like, it's not something that would, but like the Ivy Harley thing didn't ping my radar as much as it pinged yours, and it's something where you do have to be a little careful, not in terms of pleasing everybody, but at least in signaling that you know what you're doing.
Right, yeah. And I mean, there should be a pretty strong awareness of those stereotypes at this point, right? With the Penguin. I mean, as you brought up, this is not a new conversation around that character. So it gets to be, Deadpool 2, Ryan Reynolds fridges a female character right at the very beginning, and then later is like, oh, but I never heard of fridging. But it's like, you have so many self-referential jokes. Oh. So how did you not know that if you know all of this other pop culture trivia,
Right.
So
you can't it gets to be if you don't know it.
Right. So yeah, it kind of just gets to be, you don't want to call people out on this, hey, well, like that person sucks forever or whatever, because you do see these attempts that are being made, but at the same time, you just feel like you're trapped in quicksand sometimes because you're just like, I mean, we should have these conversations, but you should read about these characters before you put them in this cartoon.
Well, I for one am canceling Harley Quinn. There, done, canceled.
I'm sure it'll work out great.
No problems there.
Yeah.
So to kind of end our discussion of episode 2 on a high note, not that any of that was negative or low note, but I mean,
it was a little negative.
It's but it's negative in the right way. It's critical in the right way. In the best way. We let's look at this and see what works and what doesn't, and where they could do better. And I mean, I stand in between the two of you in a way, right? Because both this episode and other jokes and the Harley and Ivy stuff did ping my radar, but it pinged my radar to the point where I was like, I have questions,
Right.
Well, all art is a conversation, and conversations aren't just nodding in agreement. So it's good to have a thing that stumbles and then to discuss the stumbling and see if there's a way it can improve by virtue of us, talking about it. Just, not just this show in particular, but shows in general. How do we prevent these mishaps from happening again without just sort of, avoiding risk?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so speaking of that, this is the kind of higher note that I wanted to point out for episode 2 to kind of take us out, is that I love the office drama or office dramedy, I guess, of the Legion of Doom.
Okay, I've thought of this. It is one of my favorite gags of the entire show that all of the villain layers are the most obvious things in the world, and that they're going for a very Super Friends aesthetic. So, like, of course, the Legion of Doom has a building that's right there. There's a break room. There's, it's nothing is hidden, and they can play on the banality of that so well. And that break room with Bane and Scarecrow, like, I'm kind of annoyed it hasn't been done before.
Absolutely.
Right. They touch on it a little bit with Venture Brothers, right? But
yes, yeah,
I haven't seen
not fully to this extent. And yeah, I don't know. I thought it was really funny too. I love the running meta commentary once again of them being like, I can't believe nobody's discovered this place yet.
The Riddler has a giant sphinx in the park. I mean, Poison Ivy's apartment is covered in plants on the outside. The Joker has a giant Joker face on his headquarters. It's all
Batman is the greatest detective.
Seems like it, right? So how is he the world's greatest detective, or does he just fly around looking for obvious tells of his villains? It's a question. It's a question.
The Legion of Doom does press conferences on TV, and it's like totally normal.
Oh, we're gonna get to the media in this show, like the commentary on the media by this media, because that comes up a lot. And yeah, you just get the barest hint of it with Lex calling a press conference about Dr. Psycho. It's very good.
Which could be read as a commentary on the film industry, kind of full of all sorts of predators. Like when one predator is called out, it's like, oh, we're all disavowing that one guy,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Meanwhile, that's Lex Luthor, that's Bane, that's Scarecrow.
Right.
That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Sara is at Sara Century, Avishai is at Avishai W, and I am at Joshua Unruh. And the hashtag is animated discussion. Sara, where else can people find you?
I have a website, so people can find me at www.saracentury.com. Also, I've been doing some scripts for Behind the Panel through Sci-Fi, which is basically just talking, about comics. And doing a couple of short stories. So I would recommend just checking out the website because there's going to be tons of projects listed. Oh, and Bitches on Comics, of course.
Oh, yeah. All fine offerings. I appreciate all of them.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. And Avishai, what about yourself?
Just Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. I talk about screenwriting and whatever crosses my mind, and you'll probably get tired with me in about a week.
Not true, because we're still talking. Anyway, remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion. The links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, and Twitter are easy to find in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us for this animated discussion. Until next time, a cab would have been faster. You know it, I know it, we all know it.